Good afternoon to those of you who are joining us from the East Coast of the United States and Canada, and good evening to those of you who are joining us from Israel and Europe. My name is Isabel Rohr. I'm the manager of academic programs and outreach at JDC Archives, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar, which will be delivered by Robin Buller in the context of the Sorrel and Lauren Chassin JDC Archives Fellowship. I'd like to start by saying a few words about JDC Archives. JDC Archives holds the records of JDC since the organization's creation about almost 110 years ago. Visiting scholars from around the world, as well as journalists, filmmakers, family researchers, use our archives for their research. We also offer fellowships to enable scholars to conduct research in our archives. And one of these fellowships is the Sorrel and Lauren Chassin JDC Archives Fellowship, which was established in 2015 thanks to a generous gift from Sorrel and Lauren Chassin. I'd like to extend our thanks to Sorrel and Lauren, who are with us today, for their generosity in endowing this gift. Sorrel will actually be introducing today's speaker, Robin Buller, who is the recipient of the Sorrel and Lauren Chassin JDC Archives Fellowship for 2022. After Sorrel's introduction, Robin will speak for about 40 to 45 minutes. We will then entertain questions. Please note that you are muted, but you can send us questions via the Q&A function on Zoom, and you can send us questions at any time during the lecture. Sorrel will now introduce Robin.
Robin Buller is an independent historian and journalist based in Oakland, California. She has her bachelor's degree from the University of Toronto in Canada and completed her PhD doctoral degree in history at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And she was a tandem postdoctoral fellow in the history of migration at the University of California at Berkeley, and the Pacific office of the German Historical Institute. Her research on Sephardic culture and Jewish migration has been published in Yad Vashem Studies, Jewish Social Studies, and other publications. Her first book, which looks at belonging among Ottoman Jewish immigrants in interwar Paris, is coming pretty soon. I'm pleased that she was selected to receive, she was the recipient of the JDC Archives Fellowship, which I established. Robin will now start her lecture.
Thank you so much, Sorrel, for that really kind introduction and for your generous donation, which enabled me to conduct research here virtually at the JDC Archives. And thanks to Isabel as well for hosting me today. And thank you to everyone who is attending. Good morning, I should say, from California, the one greeting we were missing. So I'm going to share my screen. I have a couple of slides that accompany today's presentation, and then we will begin. So in a sepia-toned photograph from 1930, 4 people pose in the doorway of 66 Rue Sedan in the Roquette quarter of Paris's 11th arrondissement. They're standing in front of Épicerie Neymer, a spice shop specializing in delicacies from the Levant. Second from the right, the shop's proprietor, Jaco Neymer, wears a smart cap and a wrinkled grocer's jacket. That Jaco takes pride in his establishment is clear. In the window, neatly organized pans, possibly containing tomatoes, are stacked in a pyramid, while tidy baskets of vegetables and a delivery bicycle are visible in the foreground. As is evident from the shop's name, Épicerie Neymer was a family business. The young man leaning against the door frame on the left of the foursome, also wearing an apron, is Jaco's nephew, Jacques Pignas, the son of the proprietor's sister, Rosa. Between them is Solomon Neymer, Jaco's father, who was visiting from Turkey to attend his daughter's marriage to Albert Elias, the French-born son of Baghdadi Jewish immigrants. Created by and for Ottoman Jews, Épicerie Nemer served the community of Sephardi immigrants from the Balkans and the Eastern Mediterranean that had settled in the Roquette quarter of Paris. Its central location in the neighborhood made it easily accessible. The shop abutted a hotel named Hotel Cyrano, an inn that offered furnished rooms and was popular with newly arrived Ottoman Jews. Jaco was himself a resident of the same block, living at number 95. And after their marriage, Jaco's sister Estrella and her husband Albert would rent a flat just down the road at number 46 Rue Sedan. Indeed, Épicerie Nemer was one of countless Ottoman Jewish spaces that lent the Roquette quarter its moniker, Little Turkey. So a bit of background. The Roquette quarter of Paris's 11th arrondissement, a space of really just over 1 square kilometer, surrounding the bustling intersections of Boulevard Voltaire, Rue Sedan, and Rue de la Roquette, was a common destination for many of the tens of thousands of Sephardi Jews who migrated out of the crumbling Ottoman Empire and its post-Ottoman successor states to France in the first decades of the 20th century. The descendants of Jews expelled from the Iberian Peninsula in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, Sephardi Jews formed a sizable ethnic minority in the Ottoman Empire. However, in the empire's final decades, a multitude of forces, things like war, ethno-nationalisms, poverty, as well as attractive opportunities abroad, led to their widespread out-migration from cities in countries that ultimately would become Greece, Turkey, Bulgaria, places like Salonika, Edirne, Istanbul, and Izmir, all circled on this map here. Political, ideological, and cultural forces drew a large number to France as well. For one thing, after experiencing an enormous loss of life during World War I, France in the 1920s had very liberal border policies and was seen as an accepting haven for migrants of all stripes. As well, Ottoman Sephardim, like Jews elsewhere, idealized France as an exceptionally tolerant place for Jews, with it having been the first country in Europe to have formally emancipated its Jews after the French Revolution. And perhaps most significantly, Sephardi Jews had intimate cultural ties to the country. Unlike other Jewish migrants who arrived in France during this period, Ottoman Sephardim were drawn to France by a sense of shared cultural kinship. In fact, most Ottoman Jews arrived in France fluent in the French language, the result of the activities of Franco-Jewish educational organizations around the Mediterranean basin, namely those of the Alliance Israélite Universelle, which is a Paris-based Jewish organization that really perpetuated France's colonial mission civilisatrice, or civilizing mission, by exporting it to regions beyond France's formal empire, places like the Ottoman lands. So upon arrival in France in the interwar years, Ottoman Jews had this connection that other Jewish immigrant groups did not. And the photo on the right, just before I move on, is from the AIU, the Alliance's boys' school in Edirne, then Adrianople, in 1912. Numbering around 8,000 individuals in 1914, their numbers in Paris would grow to 35,000 by the outbreak of World War II, with the total number of Ottoman Jews and their children in the entire country at the time being closer to 50,000. They were part of an unprecedentedly large and diverse wave of migrants whose numbers included Eastern and Southern European laborers, American expats, Armenian and Russian refugees, and Caribbean, African, and Asian colonial subjects, as well as 150,000 Eastern European Ashkenazi Jews who also settled in France during these same decades. In Little Turkey, Ottoman Jews found community and belonging, and transformed a pocket of Paris's urban landscape in the process. And for those of you who are familiar with Paris, or perhaps for those of you who are not, I've included just a contemporary map of Paris, and in purple, you can see the sort of small 1 square kilometer area that made up La Roquette, or Little Turkey. With its streets lined with Ottoman Jewish restaurants, butchers, spice dealers, and textile shops, its apartment buildings inhabited by Ottoman Jewish families, and its center marked by the Ottoman Jewish immigrant synagogue, the Popincourt Temple. The quarter was a space in which echoes of Jewish life in the Ottoman Empire lingered in the French capital. So in my talk today, I'm going to hone in on certain parts of my current book project, which is on Ottoman Jewish immigrants in interwar and wartime Paris, to discuss the many forms that those Ottoman echoes took. We'll talk about their reverberations in neighborhood spaces and commerce, in relationships and communal associations, and in citizenship papers and other kind of legal ties, and their implications on the city of Paris, on French Jewish culture, and in the lives of Ottoman Jewish immigrants themselves. What I hope to show you at the end of it all is how practices that defined Jewish life under Ottoman rule continued to shape migrant experiences in France even after the empire's collapse. So these Ottoman characteristics and connections informed not only interwar daily lives, but also the experiences of persecution and survival during the Second World War and the Holocaust, a connection that is especially evident in documents from the JDC archives. And again, just before I move on, in the center here, this is Robert Mitrani, the child of immigrants from Salonika in Paris. In 1938, his bar mitzvah was held at the temple that I mentioned, Temple of Popincourt. And then here is a shop along Rue Popincourt. This is a crémerie, which is a dairy shop, cheese and such. In interwar Paris, Ottoman Jews found security, comfort, and community through the construction of spaces of belonging that enabled them to utilize and emphasize their Ottoman origins in everyday settings. Whereas assimilating into French life, theoretically promised civic equality, this is the land of liberty, fraternity, embracing one's own Ottoman Jewish immigrant community offered real sources of support from one's earliest days of arrival in France. On the ground, communal solidarity and kinship networks proved instrumental to things like the acquisition of work, finding housing, and securing social support. Joseph Cohen, whose family originally settled in the adjacent 20th arrondissement, remembers the sense of community he felt when his family finally moved into an apartment building along Little Turkey's most expansive tree-lined thoroughfare, Boulevard Voltaire. Quote, "Voltaire was like a little island for me, a paradise." He expressed that while there were other Sephardis in the Belleville neighborhood where he had been before, they were concentrated in the Roquette quarter. Quote again, "That is where I met the Ben Davids, the Ben Shoams, the Razons, the Ojalvos, the Toledos, the Francos." Cohen continued, referencing other Ottoman Jewish families who lived nearby. The grocers, cafes, and spice shops that specialized in Mediterranean fare stood particularly strong in his memories. Quote again, "I still have all the aromas in my nose," he mused. For immigrants like Maurice Veron, whose family arrived from Turkey in 1921, Paris's 11th arrondissement immediately felt like home. The Roquette quarter, he explained, was just like a typical Judeo-Spanish village, end quote, with cafes on every corner. And indeed, cafes were a defining feature of immigrant life in the 11th arrondissement, serving really tangible, practical purposes. They were spaces of Jewish labor and entrepreneurship in which jobs were acquired and business deals were made, of cultural preservation where Levantine food and drink were served, and of socialization where marriages and mitzvahs were celebrated over rounds of raki. One cafe, Le Bosphore, located at 74 Rue Sedan in the heart of the quarter, became the literal and figurative center of interwar Ottoman Jewish life. Its name, meaning the Bosphorus, echoed the owner's Istanbul roots while also suggesting a sort of meeting of two worlds, East and West, French and foreign. More than just a watering hole, it was a space in which Ottoman Jewish practices were perpetuated, migrant knowledge was shared, and kinship networks were nourished. It wasn't uncommon for Ottoman Jewish immigrants to learn about Le Bosphore prior to arriving in France. It was usually the first stop for newcomers who had heard rumors of it or who had seen advertisements for it in the Ottoman Jewish press. For them, the cafe was a space of initial welcome, offering Sephardi immigrants a first glimpse of the community in which they were supposedly offered sort of automatic belonging. And more importantly, it extended to them the opportunity to gain knowledge from this broader migrant network that would help them survive in a bustling city, which it was at the time home to nearly 600,000 foreign-born residents. So here you can see Le Bosphore. Unfortunately, I don't have any images of its exterior from the time period, but it existed up until the 1980s. And this is a photo of it in the 80s. You can tell from the neon sign. And on the left, Café l'Istanbul, another cafe in the neighborhood, and on the right, Café Mitrani. This is the extended Mitrani family posing in front of it. At Le Bosphore, Ottoman Jewish immigrants learned from fellow migrants where to find initial lodging in the quarter, often a room in one of several furnished hotels located near the cafe. The Hotel de l'Europe, immediately above Le Bosphore, was a common first address. And here on the left, you have a certificate of residence, and you can see that the resident, Vitali Balou, said that his place of living was at 74 Rue Sedan up here at the Hotel de l'Europe. He arrived in late 1920. The cafe also served as a space for immigrants to secure employment opportunities from fellow Jews, from fellow Ottoman Jews. For the majority of Ottoman Jewish immigrants who were poor and unskilled, this meant working as laborers or merchants. An overwhelming number worked as street vendors, following the local market schedules, peddling wares, most often textiles and household linens, that they acquired from importers or wholesalers in the neighborhoods, who were typically also Ottoman Jews themselves. The other image on this slide shows Jacques Cohen selling textiles. He has sort of a bag of textiles on the ground in front of him at the market at La Courneuve in 1935. For Eliezer Ashkenazi of Salonika, who lacked a work permit, connections made at Le Bosphore enabled him to find regular employment under the table as a tailor for members of the community. Joseph Taureau, originally from Istanbul, said that it was at the cafe, not at a brick and mortar wholesale shop, that he negotiated prices on bulk items that he later sold at markets. The Café Le Bosphore thus became not only a space of communal gathering, but also kind of the site of a microeconomy, wherein belonging to the community gave Ottoman Jewish immigrants access to labor, employment, business prospects, and goods and services, a role that cafes had played for Jews in the Ottoman lands. Cafes also preserved the inherent diversity of Ottoman Sephardi traditions and underscored how immigrants from disparate cities or regions saw themselves as distinct parts of an ethno-cultural whole. Many cafes, for instance, were tailored to specific regional or even local subgroups. Sephardim from Turkey were more likely to go to Istanbul, which I showed in the previous slide, or Chez Albert. Salonikans, on the other hand, went to Chez Sotil, Chez Motola, another cafe called Latin, the Athens. And Bulgarian Sephardim were known to frequent Chez Buko. Everyone allegedly was welcome at Le Bosphore. And these distinctions speak to how, far from being a monolithic entity, Ottoman Jewish immigrants carried variances from the Ottoman lands with them, across the Mediterranean to their adopted French homeland. And underscoring these layers, Sami Dassa, who was born in Paris to Salonican parents, stated that everyone, quote, knew who was Turkish and who was Greek. So there was a common understanding of where those divisions lay. That emphasis on local distinctions trickled down into the next generation of Ottoman Jewish immigrants in Paris as well. La Fraternité, an Ottoman Jewish youth group, held social gatherings through which they hoped to introduce young single immigrant men and women in an effort to promote Sephardi marriages. But certain matches were preferred over others. René Ben Bassat, the French-born son of Sephardi immigrants from Bulgaria and a Fraternité member, recalled in a 2014 interview, quote, "We made sure couples were from the same cities." The importance of geographic connections and enduring Ottoman roots also shaped economic practices. So for instance, Ottoman Jewish immigrants were really eager to hire and work for one another. Naturalization and immigration files show that most working newcomers cited a fellow Ottoman Jewish immigrant as their employer, as a reference. And classified advertisements in various Jewish or specifically Sephardi newspapers at the time also emphasize Ottoman origins, with one reading, quote, "A young Jewish woman from the Orient, 28 years old, recently arrived, would like to find any form of manual or factory employment with a co-religionist." Frequently, proprietors underscored their heritage in business names and in promotions in an effort to secure patronage from fellow Ottoman Jews, a practice that further entrenched their reliance on that sort of insular kinship economy that I already mentioned. Businesses not only emphasized an overarching Ottomanness, but they also played up specific local origins and identities. A sprawling promotion in one community periodical read, and I have it on the right of the slide here, "Attention, careful, do not buy a single piece of furniture before seeing Mala of Salonika," emphasizing the business's attachment to the city of Salonika in boldface type. The other images on this slide, we have the sort of newsletter from La Fraternité, and in the center here, a bunch of young Ottoman Jewish immigrants. Some of them are the children of Ottoman Jewish immigrants, including René Ben Bassat, who is second from the left, right here, and Esther Habib, who is this sort of very energetic young woman right next to him. And René Ben Bassat was the man I quoted saying, we tried to make sure people were from the same cities when they met and married. He married Esther Habib, Esther Ben Bassat now, and kind of broke his own rule. His family was from Bulgaria, hers was from Istanbul. In the interwar era, Ottoman echoes also came through in the associations, groups, and clubs that Ottoman Jews built in Paris. In November of 1921, an article in one weekly Jewish periodical drew readers' attentions to a new and noticeable group of Jewish immigrants who had made their homes in the capital. It read, "Descendants of past refugees from Spain, these co-religionists from Constantinople, Salonika, Smyrna, Adrianople, and other cities today make up a Jewish agglomeration of nearly 5,000 families, or 25,000 souls. And just like our co-religionists of the East, of Polish or Russian origin, those of the Mediterranean Orient have organized themselves, both for the needs of worship as well as for charitable endeavors. They did this first through the Association Culturelle Orientale Israélite, the Oriental Jewish Association of Paris, an organization created in 1909 by an Istanbul-born gem merchant in the hopes of giving structure to the then small but very much growing Ottoman Jewish immigrant population. And as the interwar years progressed, Ottoman Jewish associational life really expanded dramatically and dynamically in ways that reflected the associational mosaic of Jewish life in the Ottoman lands. Ottoman Jews in Paris found themselves confronted with a multitude of organizations that appealed to their diverse interests and identities. Often, organizations' connections to Ottoman Jewish life were quite overt. One, the Association Amicale des Israélites Saloniciens, the Salonican Israelite Club, sought community and unity specifically for Jews hailing from Salonika. Another, Ozer Dalim, meaning aid to the poor in Hebrew, a charitable mutual aid organization that sprung forth in Paris in 1923, took its name from a similar group that originated in Ottoman Izmir. Its charitable focus was wide, with causes ranging from hunger to education and from assistance around the high holidays to repatriation for immigrants who actually wanted to return to the Levant. Other associations that emerged in the 1930s include the Confédération Universelle des Juifs Sephardim. I have a document from them on the left of this slide. They were sort of a transnational Sephardi association that began in Paris and really sort of connected Sephardi life to France, at least in theory. And on the right, we have a document from Bnei Mizra, which was a Jewish youth group, an Ottoman Jewish youth group that emerged in 1930. Now, despite the common goals and even shared leadership, sometimes they had, the same people leading these groups of the numerous Ottoman Jewish associations that emerged, competition and sort of an inability to cooperate caused rifts. And this too echoed the scuffles between Ottoman Jewish leaders and factions that have been written about by historians of the Jews of Salonika, Izmir, and elsewhere. In a 1925 letter, one immigrant, Henri Nissim, explained just how, quote, deplorable the situation was. I'll quote him here. "You may be unaware that for a while now, steps have been taken to unify and coordinate all of the Oriental Israelite associations in Paris, which are currently separate, know nothing of each other, are jealous of each other, and at times even denigrate each other," end quote, Nissim bemoaned. He went on to say that to solve the mess, he hoped that the Alliance, that French educational group that had dominated Jewish schooling around the Mediterranean since the 19th century, would join the conversation, calling it a, quote, mother to us all. That deference to the Alliance and the suggestion that the Alliance sort of birthed modern Sephardi Jewish culture is yet another nod to the group's Ottoman pasts, only through the pointed eyes of French Republican imperialism. During the Second World War, echoes of the group's Ottoman pasts took on different forms and roles. In particular, citizenship and other types of foreign legal ties, real and perceived, emerged as both liabilities and tools of survival, depending on the circumstances. In part, this was the product of the murkiness of Ottoman Jews' citizenship status since they arrived in France. While over 70% of Ottoman-born Jewish immigrants naturalized as French during the interwar decades, and really all the children born to immigrants after 1928 were declared French at birth automatically, ambiguity concerning legal status upon arrival, as well as whether or not those legal ties and forms of citizenship endured, created confusion. Often, immigration officials had no idea how to identify the nationality of an immigrant from a collapsed empire. As well, some Ottoman Jews had access to what scholars call extraterritorial privileges, forms of foreign legal protection that were vestiges of the Ottoman era. These coveted statuses, which stemmed from capitulations agreements between the Ottoman Empire and European nations with economic interests in the Middle East, were often heritable across generations, making it so that Ottoman Jews could be protected subjects of a country without ever having set foot on that nation's soil. And to help us understand this, I've sort of brought in this case study of one immigrant, Marco Rodrigue, to help us sort of get a sense of this. So in the slide that I have here, which is from immediately upon his arrival in France, which was, you can see down here, September 22nd, 1920, we already see three different sort of national attributions. So at the top, he's listed first as an Israélite du Levant. This is sort of a made-up status that emerged during World War I in order to differentiate the Jews who were from the Ottoman lands living in France from the Ottoman Empire, which was at the time at war with France. And then below, you see that he's described also as a protégé italien, so an Italian protégé, a protected Italian subject, that sort of extraterritorial status that I alluded to. And then again below that, we can see that he was born in Adrianople, Edirne. So that confirms that he was born in what is now Turkey. Moving on to the next slide, we see a couple more descriptions for Marco Rodrigue. In 1928, he's described as having Turkish nationality, the red line here. That makes sense. We know he was born in Edirne, and he wasn't yet naturalized as French. Then in 1929, this is in a report on him from the Paris Prefecture of Police, discussing whether or not to give him French nationality, which they ultimately did. He's described as Ottoman, despite the fact that the empire no longer existed. So we see that that identity, at least on legal documents, is still enduring. Making matters more confusing is the fact that between fall 1940 and summer 1942, as the Vichy government enacted escalating laws targeting foreign-born Jews residing in France, diplomatic negotiations between Turkey and France resulted in privileges for Jews with Turkish citizenship. But this was only for those deemed regular Turkish citizens, a technical term that referred just to a small minority of Ottoman Jewish immigrants in France who had been born in Turkey and were alerted to and followed Turkey's, or Ottoman Turkey, and who were so born in Ottoman Turkey, and then who understood Turkey's convoluted citizenship acquisition laws after the establishment of the Turkish Republic. And those laws required Ottoman-born subjects living abroad to apply for a Turkish passport within 5 years of 1923, as well as pay an annual fee and annually register with the consulate. So most immigrants didn't do this. But these so-called regular Turkish citizens were spared from laws that excluded Jews from commercial activities, that barred them from civil service professions, and that forced them to comply with laws like a curfew or the Star Law. But even though the vast majority of Ottoman Jewish immigrants didn't really fit into that narrow category of having continued that registration, even among those who were born in Turkey, but also those who were born in Greece, Bulgaria, or elsewhere, they sort of acted as if they were. As information about citizenship and privileges was passed around the broader community, many sort of falsely understood themselves to be exempt from this targeted legal discrimination. So virtually every Turkish-born Sephardi immigrant presumed their exemption from the 1942 Star Law, for instance, as did a number of Ottoman Jews born elsewhere in the empire, or even in Greece. Odette Veron, along with her mother and brother, knew that they were supposed to wear a star because her parents had never registered with the Turkish consulate, and she and her brother had been born in France. Still, they chose not to, an act of defiance that really enabled them to have more day-to-day freedoms than did most other Jews. And Daniel Farhi's Turkish-born mother, who had been frustrated when she was denied French naturalization in the 1930s, now felt fortunate that she was able to use her Turkish nationality to avoid wearing a Jewish star and thus pass as non-Jewish in public. There were other exemptions that emerged too, based on foreign ties. So on the slide here, I have a document from the Greek embassy in France requesting to appoint their own temporary administrator to a business that was operated by a Greek Jewish immigrant, rather than having a French administrator run it. And in the middle, you see the same kind of document from the Portuguese embassy for someone that they described as the Portuguese Jew Asael, who we know from other documents was actually from Salonika. So that's another form of that extraterritorial connection. But Ottoman Jews were also targeted based on their origins, especially as Vichy authorities began to hand out denaturalization orders stripping individuals of their citizenship. Those who were denied or who were denaturalized either reverted back to their previous citizenship or were, completely stateless after this was taken away from them. Once her husband was denaturalized and sent to the camp of Drancy just outside of Paris, Corina Eskenazi's mother was shouted at by a resentful agent at the Turkish consulate who snarled, "Now you need our help, but until now you weren't Turks." Ultimately, Ottoman Jewish immigrants were persecuted alongside other Jews in wartime France. On the morning of November 5th, 1942, to give one example, French gendarmes invaded the 11th arrondissement and arrested over 1,100 Greek-born Jews during what the police records call La Rafle des Grecs, the roundup of the Greeks. Those who could prove Turkish, Spanish, or other national affiliations were, for the most part, left unharmed. And this is one document from the police list of everyone who was arrested during that event. Some Ottoman Jews were able to manipulate their transnational ties as a means of escaping occupied France altogether. The most useful foreign ties, as the war progressed and global travel became increasingly impossible, appeared to be with Spain. Bouko Ben Bassat, for instance, secured German-approved exit visas for his family by evoking Ottoman-era extraterritorial certificates of protection from Spain that he had inherited from his father. Another two men, Jacques Jessua's father and brother, who had Spanish papers issued by the embassy in Salonika before they left for France, crossed the border into Spain on foot and were able to survive the war that way. In one particularly striking instance, the Spanish ambassador to Paris, Bernardo Roland de Miota, organized for over 300 Ottoman Jews who could prove Spanish ties, likely through inherited protégé documents, to be repatriated to Spain. On August 10th of 1943, 79 of them boarded a train in Paris destined for Barcelona. Shortly after, de Miota, the ambassador who had defied orders to save these Jews, was removed from his post and sent back to Madrid. Documents from the JDC archives indicate just how fraught this transport was, how destitute the families were upon their arrival in Spain, and how tricky it was to negotiate their security with Spanish authorities. One of the refugees in the transport, Elia Canetti, wrote a detailed report of the event for the JDC, and I have an excerpt of it on the slide here on the right. He writes of the stress, chaos, and uncertainty that individuals experienced in the days leading up to it. And I'll quote from his letter here. On August 4th, we were advised that the transport was scheduled to leave on Tuesday, August 10th, and that the interested persons hurried to make their arrangements for departure. The list of the persons who were to leave had been changed because some people had not appeared. Others had been forgotten, and finally, the family of Carasso SIL, 2 families, had to be taken off the list. They refused to depart in spite of the urgent request of the Consul General because of the state of health of Mrs. Buena Asael Francis, widow of Haim Carasso. As in so many stories of escape from the perils of the Holocaust, family members had to make unthinkably heart-wrenching decisions. Canetti reported that one person registered for repatriation, Mr. Azaria Shiprut Behar, decided to leave, quote, in spite of the grave illness of his hospitalized wife. She ultimately died on August 10th, just a few hours before the train departed the station. Another family left despite the critical health of one of its members, who then died on a stretcher in a small Basque village just after the train had crossed into Spain. And in another painful episode, Canetti tells the JDC that 4 women, whose name was Eskenazi, had been promised their release from Drancy, that camp just outside of Paris. But the women didn't appear at the station when they were expected to, and the train left without them. On the way to Spain, Canetti related the cars were immensely crowded. Not only were the aisles stuffed with luggage, but there were only 72 seats for 82 passengers. That was 79 registered passengers, 2 Spanish authorities, and 1 woman who was able to sneak on despite not having papers. What's more, for the first leg, it was coupled with a train full of German soldiers who were on furlough and on their way to Bordeaux, adding to the fear and trauma that the passengers must have experienced. In Irun, a Basque border town, the refugees were forced to deposit all of their funds, save for 300 francs, with the French customs authorities. They were told they would get the remainder back, but because of a hiccup between the Spanish consulate and Vichy authorities, most of the passengers' funds were frozen and took months to return if they were returned at all. As a result, they couldn't afford to move on to the cities where they had been sort of assigned residence and had made plans to stay. Zaragoza, Granada, Toledo, Barcelona, making matters way more complicated. And also the hotel in Irun didn't have the capacity for all 79 passengers, so many people bunked in local households or slept outside. Quoting from Canetti again, "We had hoped that the border authorities would have been instructed by the Spanish government to let us continue our trip at the expense of the government and grant us a loan to cover the maintenance expenses incurred," he wrote, explaining that such was the way things had been done in Switzerland and Italy. But then, he wrote, "Some friends in Barcelona appealed to the joint, explaining our critical situation. The organization acted promptly. Without the aid of the JDC, all our difficulties could not have been overcome and would have had grave consequences," end quote. And on this slide, you can see the JDC index card for Elia Canetti. You can see that he arrived from France with a convoy of Sephardim, stayed at the Hotel Europa in Zaragoza, and came on August 19th, 1943. And on the right, there's a photo from the JDC archives of French refugees, mostly children, having a meal at a JDC receiving center in 1943. I include it because the man on the far right, Joel Sequeira, was the brother of Samuel Sequeira, who was really instrumental in sort of incorporating this transport of Ottoman Jews into the JDC aid fold. Thus, while it was Ottoman Jewish organizations and Spanish consular authorities who directed this transport on the French side of the border, it was the JDC who took responsibility for the refugees once they crossed into Spain. Herbert Katsky, who led the Joint's Lisbon office during the war, pushed for that, writing to his counterparts in New York that, quote, "Sephardic Jews with Spanish passports from Paris must be taken under our charge," end quote, and that there were as many as 200 people in that category, half of whom were destitute and without funds at the end of August 1943. The records also indicate that Katsuki and the JDC at least hoped that they'd be able to rescue more Sephardim with Spanish ties. Of course, 200 people is just a fraction of those who were probably eligible and living in France. In a letter to New York, Katsuki wrote, quote, "Needless to say, the information contained in this report should be used with the greatest discretion, as there remain in Paris Sephardi people whose departure from German domination we're still trying to effect." Spain, however, proved less hospitable than the JDC and Ottoman Sephardi refugees from France had hoped. Spanish authorities, Katsuki wrote in December of that same year, were adamant on the question of the departure of the entire Sephardic group from Paris. And as a result, the JDC worked to transport the refugees to North Africa, Canada, or Palestine. I'm still working to determine how many and to where they went. In the document that I have on the left, which is from September 1943, just a month really after this arrival came, you can see already that Spanish authorities are pushing the JDC to get the members of this transport out of Spanish borders and are actually blocking the JDC from bringing refugees directly from Salonika in the Balkans to Spain until that group is gone. By the end of the war, as many as 6,000 Ottoman Jewish immigrants and their children, or around 17% of that population, were deported from France. And researchers have shown that foreign consulates could have acted much further to prevent numbers from being that high. Still, when compared to the deportation rates of other foreign-born Jews in France, approximately 33%, we can infer that Ottoman Sephardim did have access to pathways of survival that were closed to others, especially Eastern European Ashkenazi Jewish immigrants. The ability to use citizenship and other foreign ties to facilitate survival didn't save all Ottoman Sephardi immigrants in France from subjugation, arrest, and deportation during the Holocaust. But rather, as I hope I've shown today, it shaped their persecution and survival in ways that differentiated their experiences from those of other immigrants in wartime France, and in ways that echoed their Ottoman origins. And I'll stop there. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much for a very rich and fascinating lecture, Robin. And I have comments to make and I have questions, and that will give a bit more time for more questions to come. So I was particularly interested by what you had to say about Spain's, the Franco regime's attitude towards those refugees. And if I can add something there, is that Spain's policy was really to, in documents they expressed that Spanish refugees should go through the country like light goes through glass without leaving a trace. So they were. It was only a country of transit. That's all they wanted to do. I want to also react on. I thought what you said about cafes as critical spaces was also fascinating, because it reminded me of Marian Kaplan's book on refugees in Lisbon. The same was true in Lisbon with the Ashkenazi Jews during the war. Cafes were a place where they congregated, where they exchanged information about available visas. So that was very interesting. And the same was true in the south of France. Ashkenazi Jews congregated in cafes in Nice and exchanged information. And the same groups continued doing this long after the war, even in the 1980s. People who had moved from different parts of Central Europe or Germany continued for years to congregate in cafes to see their old friends. So I thought that was absolutely fascinating. And I don't know if my question is can you say anything about the relationship between these new arrivals and the existing communities in France, maybe the Ashkenazi community? Like, did you come across anything in your research?
Yeah, all excellent comments and questions, Isabel, and it's obviously been such a joy working with you on this because of your expertise sort of in very adjacent topics. I want to first respond to what you mentioned about Marion Kaplan's work on refugees in Lisbon, and what you mentioned about Jews in southern France during the war. I didn't get to speak about this today just for the sake of time, although I will now. But this population that I study also sort of used these cafes as critical spaces during the war too. I only sort of spoke about them as interwar spaces, but during the war itself, Le Bosphore happened to be just around the corner from the police headquarters of the 11th arrondissement. And one refugee, or a couple of them, or immigrants, had a relationship with a certain gendarme who would tell them when roundups were going to happen. And actually in 1944, there was then a roundup at Le Bosphore because they knew that people were gathering there to sort of share information or resources as things were getting increasingly dire. And yes, such an important element, the relationship between Ottoman Jewish immigrants and the Jews who were already in France or who continued to arrive in France in the 1920s and 30s. So, Ottoman Jews sort of expected, I think because of the, curriculum and sort of ideology of the Alliance and the schools that they attended, and the fact that they spoke French, albeit likely a little bit imperfectly, as all people who learn a second language do, they kind of expected that they would be seamlessly integrated into France's existing Jewish community. But what they found upon arrival was that really wasn't the case, except for sort of the minority who were more bourgeois, who had more resources, and who lived in the 9th arrondissement, the sort of wealthier Jewish area. But for those, the vast majority who were poorer, who lived in the 11th, they actually found that they had a difficult relationship with the French Jewish establishment. The consistory frequently had meetings. The consistory, for those of you who are unfamiliar, is sort of France's Jewish governing body, had meetings in which they would talk about how this group was undermining their efforts to be, inconspicuous and sort of keep religion in the home. They did things that the consistory found very chaotic and unorganized, like hosting marriages in the home and la casa and ladino en casa instead of in synagogues, where the consistory could be more in control of things like that. And so, the French Jewish establishment didn't sort of openly welcome them as members of the fold immediately in the way that Ottoman Jews had thought. They thought of them more similarly to how they treated a lot of Eastern European Ashkenazi Jews, which was similarly with some derision and tension. And Ottoman Jews themselves, I didn't see a ton of overlap, at least in remaining documents, with Eastern European Jewish immigrants, but there were a lot of Eastern European Jewish immigrants living in the 11th as well, not necessarily in the Roquette. So they would have gone to the same schools, they would have, lived in the same, neighborhoods and buildings. So there was certainly day-to-day overlap.
Okay, and I now see that we have many questions. I usually like to group them, but I'll start and then we'll see how it goes. I'm not sure we'll be able to answer all of them, but Robin, I will share them with you afterwards. So one question is from someone who says that her father's family came to Paris from Istanbul around 1914. Their grandmother was a young child, but remembers a friendship that took them to France along with other Sephardic Jews. Did France send vessels to Turkey for this purpose? Did you ever come across anything mentioning that France helped to rescue some Sephardic Jews?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
From Turkey. So basically the question is that person's family came to Paris from Istanbul, and one member of the family remembers a French boat taking them to France along with other Sephardic Jews.
Yeah, France and England sort of after World War I had a military presence in that area. They were sort of right outside of Istanbul. And several of the people that I've seen the naturalization documents for seem to have come on French named vessels. I don't really have a sense of what the mechanics of organizing that were, other than they were boats that were going from Istanbul, typically to Marseille. Even those who migrated from Salonika to Paris seem to have first gone to Istanbul and then to Marseille. My assumption is not necessarily that it was the French government organizing sort of rescues, if you will, or like large migrations of Jews from Istanbul and elsewhere, but more that the boats that happened to be going to Marseille were French boats.
Okay. Would you, okay, so now we have a question about the First World War period. Would you say a few words about the wartime, First World War time experience of Ottoman Sephardim in France? Were they conscripted? What was their position on the immediate post-war period vis-a-vis the dissolution of the empire?
Yeah, this is a great question. And Isabel, maybe I can send you an article that I've written about this topic that we can share with people who are interested after. But so there were, several thousand Ottoman Jews in France and in Paris specifically during World War I. Initially, when the war broke out, for those who didn't, have French citizenship, they were declared enemy aliens, and there were camps that were set up where they were going to be directed to go. Some people had to go and briefly stay in these camps. But then sort of a number of forces, including Jewish leaders in France and in what's now Turkey or Greece, as well as the Alliance and the French government, worked together to create that status that I briefly mentioned when we were looking at the immigration document of Marco Rodrigue, Israélite du Levant, which sort of made Ottoman Jews this other group that wasn't thought of as Ottoman necessarily. Ottoman isn't in the name, they're from the Levant, and they were no longer treated as enemies of the state. Those who were citizens, the few who were citizens at this time, very small number, were conscripted, but a large number enlisted voluntarily. So records show that as many as 2,000. I think that's a bit of an exaggeration, but that's from newspaper articles at the time, enlisted. And after the war, there was a memorial set up by the community, by one of those associations that I mentioned, the Association Culturelle Israélite Universelle. So many iterations of sort of similar words that was set up, that ultimately was erected in 1936. Although the project started in 1920, they were trying for a decade and a half to get this memorial set up specifically for Ottoman Jews. They call them Oriental Jews on the plaque, who died for France during World War I.
Wonderful. Thank you for this very comprehensive answer. And if you can send us that article, we'll send it to the person who asked that question and anyone else who might be interested. At the start, this is we're moving forward in time. We might have to move backward. At the start of World War II, what percentage of Jews in France were of Ottoman descent or Sephardi descent? I think Sephardi descent might be difficult to say. I don't know if you know Ottoman, of Ottoman descent.
Yeah, so I have rough figures in my book manuscript. One element that makes all of this difficult to figure out is that in French sort of citizenship documents, for the most part, except for those produced during the war, religion isn't stated. And so I'm sort of sometimes moving backwards from someone's name to determine if they, were Jewish in any other indicative way. I estimate, I think I say 12% in my book. Don't hold me to that because I need to double check. But there were as many as 50,000 Ottoman Jews and their children who were French-born in France at the outbreak of World War I. And I think the number's 350 or 400,000 at the outbreak of World War II. So I will let someone who's better at math do that. But yeah, I think it's around 12%.
Okay.
But that includes their children who were French-born. I just want to clarify that, not, who were, born.
We have a question about the geography or the like where the 11 arrondissement is located, and someone is asking if this is the same neighborhood as the Marais where the Eastern European Jews lived.
Yeah, right adjacent. So I could sort of go back to the map if that would be helpful. But if you look at a map of Paris, the arrondissements are like it's a snail pattern, and the 3rd and the 11th are actually right next to each other, and then the 20th, the other one that I mentioned. So somewhat it feels confusing to think of 3, 11, and 20 all next to each other, but those are on the sort of northeast side of the city, heading northeast. Those arrondissements are right next to each other. So yeah, definitely same regions, same areas.
And we have a question here. Did you find that the Ottoman Jews in Paris were in contact, in dialogue, or relied in any way with other Ottoman refugees in interwar Paris, like the Armenians? Yeah,
this is a really, something that I would love to have dug into more. I direct you to Ethan Katz's book, Burdens of Brotherhood, Bonds of Brotherhood, one of those two. It's an amazing book about sort of Jews and Muslims from North Africa in Paris, and it starts in the period that I studied, goes well beyond. But he shows that there were interactions, especially in certain spaces like restaurants and sort of social, cultural spaces like that. I didn't find as much, but I might have been looking in different places.
We have a remark from someone who says that the Spanish Revolution probably, I guess the person means the Spanish Civil War, probably affected the permission to enter Spain, since there were German influences in Spain. And I don't know if you've looked into that, but
not yet on specifics, but definitely.
It certainly did. I mean, Franco came to power thanks to the help of Hitler and Mussolini, and there were certainly strong German influences in Spain, but there was also a native anti-Semitism mixed in the mix.
One element that's interesting there is just the militarized culture of Spain, and how people crossing refugees crossing over would be sort of immediately arrested first by Spanish police, and then could be released and sent into aid situations by groups like the JDC.
Certainly. And I think a few people, I think at least one person, a few people want to know what happened afterwards. I think you said that this is your next research. One question is, did people end up remaining in Spain, or did they return to France?
I don't think that anyone that I study, so I have a database. I saw someone asked if there's a list of names. I have a database of several thousand that I'd be happy to share with you. There isn't anything official or that I've found in sort of other archives other than deportation lists, but there isn't sort of a database that brings together the sort of experiences of migration to the post-war period. So happy to share that as you research your family. But to answer this question, no one that I have identified seems to have stayed in Spain. Many came back to France. There definitely still is a community there that's active, an association that's been super instrumental in collecting testimonies and documents. Muestros Desaparecidos is in Paris. El Siete is sort of a group that's affiliated with them as well, named after the temple that I mentioned, Temple Popincourt, which was at 7 Rue Popincourt, so El Siete. But yeah, not many remaining in Spain. However, they went elsewhere too. So quite a few chose to migrate to Israel, some to the US, some to Canada. Yeah, so, but there wasn't necessarily a sense that they wouldn't go back to France after the war. They very much reestablished. And some groups of the associations that I mentioned, for instance, the Confédération, the Universal Confederation of Sephardi Jews, I briefly mentioned it, Paris created. That was sort of the origin group of the World Sephardi Foundation. So these elements of the interwar period that might have been put on pause during the war, sort of revisited and brought back after the war.
I'm going to ask you another question, and maybe we'll call it the last question. Someone wrote, I thought that France began by sending non-French Jews to the camps in response to German requests, making foreign-born Jews more likely to be deported than French-born Jews, while you suggest foreign-born Jews were more protected. Can you explain?
Oh, sorry if I misspoke. No, that's not what I'm trying to suggest. You're absolutely right. Foreign-born Jews were more targeted than French-born Jews. But there were little exceptions to that. So in the case of those who had, and especially has been researched by Corey Gutstadt, who I saw asked a question earlier, definitely go to her book about this. But with regular Turkish citizenship, for the first years of the war, were able to avoid certain anti-Jewish laws. And there were sort of a couple other groups who were able to get similar protections, even Greek Jews, but only until Germany invaded Greece in 1941. But for the vast majority of Jewish immigrants in France, they were much more vulnerable than French-born Jews. And that's where also the element of citizenship is interesting, because while in the earliest years of the war, before they were denaturalizing people, there were more people who qualified as French Jews, but then as people had their citizenship stripped of them, then they were sort of back in the category of being treated like foreign Jews. By mid-1943, though, really everyone was in danger.
We have one more question, but I don't see it. I think someone wants to know if you found any reference to music by Ottoman immigrants in the JDC archives. Have you seen anything of the sort? I don't know if this is
not in the JDC archives, but in French archives, yes. Albert Cohen seemed to have been a prominent composer. This was something that I briefly thought about really delving into, because there's definitely material on that in archives in France, in the National Library and other places. But I just didn't end up going in that direction. But yes, there's definitely material.
Albert Cohen, the writer, the same Albert
the writer,
Cohen?
And then there was also a composer named Albert Cohen. There were a lot of people named Albert Cohen, I found.
Actually, did Albert Cohen, the writer, come from during that period, just after World War I, right? But he went to Marseille, right?
Yeah, correct.
I think we'll call it a day. Robin, this was so fascinating. Just made me want to go to France and be there. It was so rich. And thank you for the great visual. And thank you to our participants for joining us. The next JDC Archives program will take place on July 12th. Another JDC Archives fellow, Dr. Daniel Battisti, will give a lecture on JDC navigation of Jewish migration and resettlement under the International Committee for European Migration between 1951 and 1954. Invitations will be sent out next week, and you will also be able to register via our Facebook page. And we hope that many of you will be able to join us. And if you want to be on our mailing list, please sign up for our newsletter. And again, thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much for the great questions, everyone. And thanks, Isabel, for the invitation. This is really, really great.